Hello guys and welcome to my new video, and today we're looking at the best or top 3 healers, and we're going to be combining my experiences in Raid and Mythic Plus. So the healers that are going to make this list are healers that are doing well both in high-end Mythic Plus content and Mythic raiding content so far. Again, big disclaimer before any of these videos, you have to keep in mind this is looking at top-end content. If the healer that you're playing right now does not make the list, does not mean you should not play them. Considering you're paying a monthly subscription, get the most value out of your money. And on top of that, a lot of people are looking at pre-patch, they're playing pre-patch, and they're determining which healers are going to be strong based on that pre-patch information, which can be very misleading because on live servers right now you have covenant abilities, you have conduits, you have legendaries, which are not going to be available in Dragonflight or right now in Dragonflight Beta. And on top of that, you do not have the biggest change, that is the increase to player stamina and creature damage, which is only available at level 70. This change alone felt a lot more impactful than I first anticipated. So for the people who are playing purely pre-patch, there's going to be a lot of things that are changing when Dragonflight is going to launch. And you also have to consider that the 40% stamina change is going to impact healers that tend to do a lot of overhealing, or healers that provide some passive damage reduction, because they're going to gain a little bit more. And again, if you enjoy this type of content, if you enjoy my healer videos so far, please like and subscribe. It really helps me to continue to do this full time. So let's go to our first healer, and it's important to differentiate that we're looking at Raid and Mythic Plus, and we're combining those in terms of how the healers are performing right now in order to make this list. So you might have certain healers that are really good at raids but pretty average on Mythic Plus, which might not be included here. And the first healer, and I think it's not going to be a surprise for many, but that is going to be Restoration Druid. I truly believe if nothing changes from right now to the release of Dragonflight is going to be known as the Resto Druid expansion. I think Druids are going back to some of their glory days back in the previous expansions. I think Druid is to some extent almost an undisputed king in Mythic Plus content, because the 40% stamina change really did allow their HOTS to do the work. You can do a lot of the Mythic Plus content right now in beta, and you can allow your HOTS to do a lot of the work for you, and then if someone needs, or the group needs, AoE healing, you have a lot of AoE healing burst potential, because there's a lot of things that are going to buff your wild growth, things like Soul of the Forest, things like your tier set, and all of a sudden your wild growth is going to be impactful. That can also be flourished for extra HPS. I think Resto Druid is going to feel right at home in Dragonflight Mythic Plus, because there is a lot of things that are going well for them. I think there's very interesting spec talent tree nodes that you can invest your points in. I think there's multiple different builds that are emerging right now, and I think all of the builds are really fun, especially if you combine it with something like Feral Form. And to build on top of that point, I think Resto Druid is an easy healer to start with, but has an incredibly high skill ceiling, which means that you can invest a lot of time into Resto Druid, because you will have to optimize or know damage patterns, you will have to optimize your DPS through multiple different means, and that is only a good thing. I also think that Druid is relatively durable, it has a decent amount of utility, but when you go into raid situations, I think a lot of the power of Resto Druid comes from their HPS. And I don't think Resto Druid is going to be considered as a mandatory raid healer. I think it's going to be a good raid healer, but a lot of that power, again, I mentioned, is coming from the fact that they provide good HPS, and that can change at any given moment. But you also have to consider that you will always have at least one Druid in your raid group, because you need that Mark of the Wild. Mark of the Wild is an insanely strong raid buff, both in raids and Mythic Plus content. Some of the negatives about Resto Druid right now is that they do not get any healing increase by dealing damage, which a lot of other healers do. So you have to make a conscious decision when you want to apply Moonfire, Sunfire, go into your Feral Form, apply bleeds and things like that, which can be off-putting to someone who's looking to start Resto Druid as a new healer. So I do think that Resto Druid is probably going to be the most hyped healer in Dragonflight unless something changes. So if you're someone who's looking to play Resto Druid, I think you're going to be very happy, because it is a relatively easy healer to pick up, but I think it has a high skill ceiling that allows you to spend hours in order to optimize your Druid gameplay. And now let's go to our second healer, and that is going to be, surprise surprise, the flagship product of the expansion. That is going to be Preservation Evoker. I think it's important to note that there is a new healing class approaching in Dragonflight, and I think Blizzard does not want the class to feel or be relatively weak, because they do want new players to experience the class. And I think one of the best ways for players to experience the new product of the expansion is to make them relatively strong. I think Preservation Evoker, just like Resto Druid, is going to shine in Mythic Plus content, because you do have things like your empowered abilities, which honestly can bring people from the brink of death. The whole group can get topped up by these relatively low cooldown abilities, which cannot be said for a lot of other healers after the 40% stamina change. So Preservation Evoker, again, you do have to get used to the playstyle because it is a new class. The empowered abilities feel really strong, especially because they have a relatively low cooldown. You have a good DPS with a relatively simple rotation. As long as you can cast or aim your fire breath, you're going to be relatively okay. And you can also get rewarded with healing through your damage with talents like Life Giver's Flame. There seems to be multiple different builds for Mythic Plus and Raid depending on how you want to spend your essences, which is only a good thing because it's going to provide variety to your healer and probably elongate your playing time as Preservation Evoker in the next expansion. And I also have to mention the Preservation Evoker has some really strong burst healing capabilities, probably one of the strongest burst healer right now depending on the talent build you're running, because you have multiple things like Tip the Scales, you have things like Rewind, you have things like Stasis, which basically allow you to bring the whole party from the brink of death to full HP. When we go to raid comparison, I don't think Preservation Evoker is all that mandatory, and I think a lot of its power is going to be tied into the HPS that it can provide. You do have a raid buff in terms of Blessing of the Bronze, which honestly is not really comparable to a lot of other classes buffs. You do have talents that increase mobility, you do have things like Rescue, which can be really strong in niche situations. You could also argue the Preservation Evoker using something like Temporal Anomaly in raid situations can provide absorbs, but you cannot really compare the absorbs that Temporal Anomaly provides to something like Discipline Priest Rapture Ramps, which are incredibly powerful. You also have to consider the Preservation Evoker has 30-yard healing range for majority of its heals, which is significantly lower than other healers, which can be a deal breaker depending on which raid encounter you're doing. But given the fact that they're so strong in Mythic Plus and they're pretty decent in raid situations, I think it is important to list them in this ranking. And the last healer that I'm going to include in this list is going to be Holy Paladin, and I do think that the order of the healers here could actually be mixed up depending on who you ask. But Holy Paladin has always been a strong healer, and that is regardless if you think the direction or the playstyle of Holy Paladin is fun. Holy Paladin in this list is going to be the reverse of Resto, Druid and Evoker, because I think the true potential is going to lie in the raid healing, because the niche of the sustained tank healing has always been strong, especially at the start of a new expansion. The niche can also be increased depending on how the tank tuning goes. So if the tanks are going to require constant babysitting, I think every single mythic and raiding guild is going to bring at least one Holy Paladin. And the fact that Holy Paladin in raid situations can have multiple builds in terms of melee, in terms of range, in terms of Marads, you have a lot of variety choices, and you have to consider that the Marads build provides so much spot healing that can be really strong in progression. You can be the healer that's going to be responsible for saving the people from the brink of death, especially in that high-end mythic raiding content. And you also have to look at the fact that Holy Paladin does provide damage reduction. You do have Devo Aura, which is not, again, exclusive to Holy Paladin, but it does provide 3% damage reduction to the whole raid, and that can be increased up to 15% damage reduction when you use Aura Mastery for really heavy AoE situations. So I think the combination of a strong niche, sustained tank healing, and the fact that you provide damage reduction is very attractive for any raid leader that is looking to create a healing composition for the next expansion. And now when we go to Mythic Plus, I don't think Holy Paladin is going to be as strong as something like Resto, Druid or Preservation Evoker in high-end Mythic Plus content, but it's hard to ignore the utility that Holy Paladin can bring to the group. Holy Paladin is a very toolkit and utility with things like immunity. You have a 1-minute Blessing of Sacrifice, which can be a very strong tank defensive. You also have Blessing of Protection, which can situationally be very strong. Oh, and I forgot, Holy Paladins also have Battle Res, which again, we have to see how the engineering Battle Res is going to turn out, but that could be potentially very good. But there are a couple of negatives to Holy Paladin. I think it can be somewhat difficult to play a melee healer, especially if you're inexperienced, especially given the fact that melee build is going to be strong in Mythic Plus environment, because again, you have an interrupt that requires you to be in melee, you have Crusader Strike that gives you holy power, and you have to be in melee. And I do think that Holy Paladin can have mana issues following your basic rotation, but I think people will find ways around that. And to summarize the video, this concludes my list of all the top 3 healers that I feel are really strong right now when you combine their Mythic Plus and raid performance. Again, anything can change because a lot of the healers do depend on their HPS numbers, which can be changed relatively easily. And again, don't feel down if your healer did not make this list, because anything can change, and I really urge people to prove me wrong and play the underdog healer that you really enjoy and do really well in high-end Mythic Plus and high-end Mythic raiding content. And there are multiple healers that did not make the list, because for example, Discipline Priest can be regarded as an almost mandatory raid healer because the shielding meta or the absorbs that he can provide through something like Rapture Ramps is really powerful in raid environment, but it can be somewhat weaker in something like 5-man content. Almost the same thing could be said about Mistweaver Monk. Mistweaver Monk, I feel, is going to be one of those healers that is going to shine more in raid content than it does in Mythic Plus, and that is purely based on the fact that you did have the 40% stamina increase, and I think the Vivify Triage healing is not that strong in Mythic Plus. Holy Priest did not make the list because it is a good healer in Mythic Plus, it is a decent healer in raids, but it doesn't seem to excel in any type of content right now. It almost feels like a jack of all trades, master of none. But if you're looking for a great beginner's healer, honestly Holy Priest has to be the #1 choice. And Resto Shaman did make the list, but I honestly feel that with a little bit of tuning, especially with increase to HPS, it could help them a lot. I do think the Resto Shamans are going to miss the fact that they don't have the tier set from Shadowlands, they don't have totems spewing out chain heals. I think there should be some further reworks towards Resto Shaman tree, maybe new abilities being changed, but I'm unsure about how willing Blizzard is towards making some impactful changes so close towards the expansion release. Again guys, thank you for watching this video. I really do urge you to not follow these lists blindly. I really do think that if you enjoy a certain class, you should stick with that class because again, I mentioned at the start of the video, you're paying money to play this game and you should get some value out of it. Let me know if you feel there are certain other healing specs that should make this list when you combine raids and Mythic Plus in terms of the performance. And if you like this content, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.